Hello and welcome to Rule of Carnage, a podcast for your eyes or a video series for your ears, where we talk about designing better miniature games. My name's Mike. I have designed some miniature games. This guy's Glenn. He done the same. And last time we were on this channel, we were talking about hobby personas, the sort of players that you might have approaching your game and how they might approach your game from a hobby perspective. A couple episodes back, we talked about the sort of gameplay personas that we had thought about from both the work that Wizard of the Coast did with Magic the Gathering and the sort of general received wisdom in video game land about what player types there are. But as I was talking about on the Tabletop Talk podcast a couple of weeks back, link in the description below, there is a fairly unique component with tabletop miniature games where you have to do quite a lot of physical preparation in order to get the game on the table. And we talked last time about the sort of preparing the game area and what you can do as a games designer to maybe make terrain more inspirational for the sort of players that might be approaching the game. And we maybe focused a little bit on players who like terrain and maybe didn't talk enough about players who don't like terrain and how you can help and support them. But I think what we'll do now is we'll have a conversation about the models. We've talked a bit about model agnosticism, and I think with when you're thinking about your game, there's clearly going to be people who love modeling and want to squeeze as much modeling juice or painting juice out of engaging with your game system as possible. There are other people who, way on the other end of the spectrum, kind of don't care and they're just signifiers for rules presence on the table. And then there are people kind of in the middle who, maybe like some models but don't have all the time or all of the motivation to do a ton of modeling and painting, and maybe you're just playing with unpainted models that are stuck together, or maybe subbing in models from other places. So yeah, there's a range of people that might be engaging with your game, and Glenn, I think we're going to try and figure out how best to help all of them.
Yeah, ideally. So I think sort of an interesting place to maybe start from this is to talk about, I think the two sort of like most polar opposites on this is the sort of games are an excuse to paint miniatures versus the, miniatures are a necessity to play these games sort of mindsets. It's like on the first end of the scale, there's, the Ink 28 community is a great community that's extremely sort of creative. But I do think that there are a lot of people in that community who almost never play the game or have no interest in playing a game. They want to be sort of driven and inspired to the model making and the model creation. And there's certainly people throughout the hobby who are on that end of it. But I think it's interesting that...
Right, and there's people even further on that side who just paint and don't even care. And another expression of this is I buy a lot of models because I'm like, oh, that model's cool. I want it. And then I have it and maybe I paint it and maybe I don't. But then I want to play with it. And so the model comes first and then the what rules system should I use for this model comes second, as opposed to the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah, but then I think at the same time, it is that sort of, I think the more natural sort of central bulk of people want to get as much value out of the thing they have acquired as they can. And the first blush of value is often, I love the mini and I love painting the mini. Oh, I understand there's a thing you do with this mini once it's painted, which is apparently enjoyable. I'd like to get that additional value out of the thing I've bought, and they move on to it. I think that the sort of the tale of people who literally only paint and then put it on a shelf is quite thin. And I think part of the reason that maybe you can
maybe citation needed on that.
I
think GW makes a good chunk of its money from people who don't play the games.
Well, and this thing, I think it's interesting, but this is very much the point.
Because there's a whole collector there as well, where I want to collect things even if I'm not that interested in painting or playing.
But then I think it is equally interesting how many people are painting GW minis, and it's not okay, they're high quality minis, but there are like minis like of a range of IPs in the world that are very nicely made and are very high quality, that despite being bigger IPs don't necessarily, I think, sometimes get as many people painting them. There's something about the the mechanical offering that you could be engaging with these minis at some
But
point.
anyway, let's move on from GW, because I think we're interested in who exists and what can you do as a games designer.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, absolutely, there are people who are drawn to the idea of a particular mini, collecting and painting it. And obviously, if you're offering a miniatures agnostic game, how do you talk to those people? How do you get them in? How do you inspire them? And I think that this is one of those areas where lore obviously is one of the sort of obvious ways of tracking those people in, and how you approach a miniatures agnostic set of lore, set of descriptive and narrative rules in a way that somebody who, despite the fact you don't have a miniature attached to like your game inherently, because you're not necessarily have that capacity, will want to pick up your book and read your book in order to go, oh, this is very inspiring for miniatures. And obviously a lot of that, I think, will be driven by the sort of people who enjoy your game and evangelize about it and put pictures of their minis up online. And then somebody who wants to make minis looks at those pictures and go, what inspired this person? What inspired these creations? I must look at this and gather my own inspiration from it.
And I think there's an accessibility question here as well, where, you know, you might be providing your own miniature line, and that makes it easier to get in. And then you might make your game more or less agnostic about whether you're using your specific miniature line, and that will increase or decrease the accessibility. And then there's also the expectations that you put on the player. So if you start to sort of suggest that they need to be, you know, representing all the weapon options in a what you see is what you get kind of a way, or with your art, you're sort of saying, hey, this is the kind of game where you have to convert every miniature in a sort of Ink 28 or, you know, or Sludge or similar kind of way, where you're providing an aesthetic and you're sort of almost making a demand on the hobbyist. Like that reduces the accessibility, but it also increases the kind of attractiveness for a particular kind of player. And then in terms of the accessibility, you've also got this angle where, like, regardless of whether you're providing your own miniatures or not, if you go for a niche theme versus a very common theme, then that's also a super interesting way of like broadening the sort of catchment of types of hobbyists that you might get. Because if I'm making a World War II game in 28 mil, like maybe I introduce some specific and unique elements, but I always know that basically most hobbyists are going to be able to find gear for that, even if my game doesn't have miniatures or my miniatures aren't distributed everywhere.
Yeah, and I think that's a really strong point you sort of hit on there. And like referencing back to Sludge and things like Forbidden Psalm, Last War, things like that, games that do alternative historical aspects to it, because it's like, obviously there's tons of historical minis in the world. There were historical minis like before, you know, a lot of gaming minis. They're widely available, and giving the person who's inspired by the background and the modeling the opportunity to say, you can pick up these guys super cheap everywhere you go, and here's the twist I'd like you to put on them, here's the way I'd like you to interact with them, I think is a really strong way of sort of approaching those people. And I think also it then allows the other end of the spectrum to go, yeah, but I can just put down like my World War II minis, right? It'll be fine. It won't look peculiar that I've not, you know, given them steam-powered rifles. They'll pass just fine. Because it's like, to my mind, one of the things that it makes me think of, like when I first started playing Saga, I just used Warhammer Fantasy Battle minis because they were close enough. And I think one of the ways of bringing together those two ends of this sort of player type is to give there's a generally available, and you might well have in your collection, close enough version where people won't look at you, you know, askew when you put those guys down and say, these are Sludge riflemen, they're Napoleonics, but you know, that'll pass. And then giving the other people who want to approach the modeling end of it before they even approach the game, this thing of saying, okay, look, here's an available range of miniatures, a widely available range of miniatures, and here's where I want you to go in and be inspired and engage with it.
Yeah, and Osprey have hit this really, really well a bunch of times. Like, setting aside the games and whether they're played or not, like things like like a great example recently is Joe McCulloch's Silver Bayonet. Like, can you get Napoleonics in 28? Yes. Can you get Werewolves and Vampires in 28? Yes. Let's smash those together, and that's a super easy game to build for. The same thing is even true with like that game about Romans and monsters fighting. Broken Legions, yeah. Like, two very easily accessible, quite a lot of like Roman stuff is available in plastics because of Warlord Games. Like, it's almost like pick two ranges of miniatures that are easy to acquire and smash them together. Like, can I get giant robots and dinosaur miniatures? Right, let's make a game out of those two.
Absolutely, and I really do personally. I really think this is one of those.
Don't make a game about those two. That's my job.
You're having that one. Yeah. I think this is one of those areas where, particularly as an independent like designer, this is one of those places where you can deal with product design issues that you might not have the resources to deal with as an independent by intelligent game design. Yep. you can probably write a game for a range of settings and a range of worlds. And I'm not saying sort of like paint the theme on, but I'm saying find genuine inspiration from a range of themes, from a range of things that can solve your product problems before they arise. It's like when we were talking about like some of the prototyping and like when to start looking at miniatures for your games. I think it's a good idea to check whether before you write an independent game that there are minis like easily accessible for it. You really will pay yourself out at the far end of it to the number of people who will pick the game up when you go, look, you've probably got these minis, or at least a version of these minis, and then you play it and I tell you, oh, the mini you've already got, why not do this with it? And you go, oh, that's very inspiring. And then you can hopefully create this sort of virtuous hobby loop, because there is a
like a good example of that is, Dracula's America takes two things that are easily accessible: cowboys and vampires. Yes, great, we can play that game. Like, I could write a game which is set in a I could make a game that's set in a 1920s like mental hospital gone mad, a sort of Arkham Asylum thing, and what I need is loads of doctors and orderlies and loads of Cthulhu baddies. And like, okay, I can get the Cthulhu baddies. Can I get reasonably easily doctors and orderlies from 1920s? Not really, like almost, but not quite. So that's going to be a difficult game to sell in, even though it sounds cool.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that if you ever sort of approach wanting a significant level of unarmed sort of
civilians, unarmed civilians, or just generally like non-combat miniatures.
Yeah, and then this is where a little bit of sort of forward research, when you're right there in that brainstorming phase of a game, can really pay dividends later on. Because there are a lot of things I often sometimes think, oh, this will be so easy to find. This will be really easy to find miniatures for. I'll start knocking together some ideas for it, and then I'll look up and find the minis for it. And it's like, no. And it's like, there are some things where, as I've mentioned before, you can find zombies in every flavor on the internet. Can you find a businessman in a suit with a briefcase? Oh, no. Unless
only one with a bionic eye and a gun.
Yeah, unless his guts are coming out, or he's holding a bazooka. And so a little bit of looking for
the old business bazooka.
The old fire my briefcase at you from range. That's a game. So a little bit of consideration.
So, it sounds like the bit in Brazil where the paperwork explodes everywhere. Maybe you're just launching like forms at people that they have to complete before they can activate.
Absolutely. A little bit of sort of pre-consideration, a little bit of sort of forward research, considering where the sort of, again, we if you're designing an independent game, if you're designing a niche game, there's a bell curve of sort of hobby, and the more easily you can like hit that bell curve and bring as many people in, reducing the sort of the cliff that they have to come into, where you don't say you need to acquire a whole bunch of very specific minis. And like, so
I guess like, well, the what does Mike do version of this. So I've got 3 games published. and they all basically approach this problem in the same way, which is that I provide a table of generic unit archetypes. And so whether that's, chassis of vehicles in Gaslands, whether it's classes of spaceships in A Billion Suns, or whether it's kind of unit types of rank and flank sort of medieval combatants in Hobgoblin. The other thing is that each of those games does not have, and this might be a weakness that I'm not leaning into enough, but like they don't have like a strange intersection of two genres that makes it more complicated. They are just each a fairly well understood sort of bang in the middle of that genre piece. And then they provide, like, from these generic shells, they provide a fairly flexible set of build it how you want it kind of mechanics, so that in each of these cases, the basic rule system is saying, yes, whatever it is that you can find, you can have, and it will work in this game. And it doesn't have, the faction system isn't a breakdown of different factions where you're like, okay, these guys live in canoes and they have to be wearing triangular hats, and if they're not wearing short trousers, then they're not welcome in this faction, because for a miniature agnostic game, that's kind of irritating and not really very helpful. And there are other miniature agnostic games that have those kinds of factions where they either do this successfully by saying that you can use, they basically latch onto existing sort of subclasses of miniatures. So whether it's like a kind of historical game where they're saying, well, these are basically the English and the French and the Spanish, or a game like your Borders and Black Flags, where it's like, okay, there's obviously an undead pirate faction, there's obviously a normal pirate faction, there's obviously like, these different classes of miniatures that you can find from other manufacturers. But you run into the risk there where your game isn't as like broadly accepting of any of the genre miniatures versus what you and I have worked on, which is creating faction systems that sort of encourage gameplay and theme to stick together, but not in a model must look like X kind of a way.
Yeah, and I think when you're thinking about this, when you're researching it, thinking about the availability of these things, like, obviously with Gaslands, the thing that Gaslands does, it says, the Hot Wheels car, bash it up and make it post-apocalyptic. Super available base thing, hobby opportunity. With A Billion Suns, not everybody is inherently going to have a fleet of spaceships, so going any old fleet of spaceships genuinely, because it's a bit more of a cliff to acquire them. A great example of this quickly, I think, is Frostgrave. It basically says, do you own fantasy monsters? These are the fantasy monsters this game's going to be using. And not to sort of kick a game, but I've heard a few people mention Ragnarok as being, I think, quite a difficult entry point, because it has these monsters that are like super specific to sort of Nordic legend. And a lot of people go, oh, what a cool game. All right, okay, I've got to acquire an etin and a what and a how. And so sometimes you can sort of bring people up short who really want to engage with the game because they think they have to acquire these things.
Right, and the way that game could have been written is to say, like, an etin is a giant. Giants can be etins and giants and two-headed giants and frost giants and blah blah blah, and here's some suggested rules or some variants, but like what you're building is a giant, and a giant will always work. But if you're clever enough to go and find the one that most closely matches the Viking, then have a gold star, but it's everything else still functions.
Yeah,
so that Warhammer giant you've got, or that Dungeons and Dragons giant that you've got, like, those are fine too.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll offer people a path in and then show them the mountain in many ways.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, okay, here's your base level and here's what you could aim for, and then you can find anywhere on that path to inspire you. If you found a game that let you in very gently and then sort of teased you up to the top of the mountain, where you ended up building multiple armies of incredibly bespoke miniatures, please do let us know about it in the comments section. These games hopefully inspire people to hobby. and inspiring people to hobby is absolutely a virtuous circle for playing your game, doing more hobby, and therefore wanting to play the game more and wanting to talk to other people about the game. So, you know, if there's been a game that has encouraged you to become an evangelist, to talk to other people about it, because how it brought you into the hobby side of it, we'd love to know about it. Love you to sort of drop down to the comment sections to tell us about it. If you're in the comment section, there's a like button and a subscribe button right there. You may as well just give them both a quick punch.
Doesn't hurt. It doesn't hurt you.
No, absolutely. Once you've done that, swing by the Discord, because there's a whole bunch of people inspired by miniatures and hobby and putting things together and using them in tabletops, and you'll be welcome and in with friends if you go in there and talk about being inspired by miniatures and hobby and games. But for now, it's going to be a thank you and goodbye from this episode of Rule of Carnage. I hope that this was useful. So thank you and goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.